We might get started. Bonnie, if you would like to get started with an acknowledgement of country, that would be great.
Sure. So I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians on the land from which I'm joining you all today. That's my people, the Gamilaraay people. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to our ancestors, elders today, and those who are emerging, and acknowledge the continued connection to culture, country, waterways, skies across all Indigenous nations. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the ancestors and elders on the country that you are joining us today. So may we always acknowledge the rich diversity, strength, and that continued connection of our fellow Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders across this great, beautiful nation of ours. Always was and always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land.
Thanks, Bonnie. For everyone who's just joined, I'm just going to let everybody know that we are recording today's session. So we're going to have this available because there was obviously lots of people who wanted to be able to join today that aren't able to be here at this time. So we will be recording the session, but we do ask that everybody keeps their video off, and obviously everyone is muted. But we would love to hear from you. So we do have the chat down the bottom. So please introduce yourselves, and obviously as we go through today's session, feel free to put any of your questions into the chat. We'll be asking a few questions to start with, but obviously we would love to have your questions answered as well. So we will get to those. So as we're going along, pop them into the chat and then we'll start to look at them. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Zana Bowen. I'm a proud palawa woman, and I'm the School and Youth Relationship Manager for World Vision. I'm also the leader of our Teachers for First Nations Education program, which is a program that we have started for teachers to help them embed more First Nations perspectives in the classroom and to help their schools become more culturally capable. I'm joining you all today from beautiful Quandamooka country, so I would pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders here on the land that I'm joining you from today. We would also like to introduce, we have Craig Duncan, who is going to be one of our speakers today. Craig is a Gamilaraay man from Macquarie. He's the Aboriginal Education K-12 officer with the Maitland Newcastle Diocese. So thank you, Craig. Welcome, and so pleased you could join us today. We also have Helen Cooney joining us today. Hello, Helen.
Hi.
Helen has over 45 years experience in education, previously as a principal, a teacher, and she is currently consulting along in her role with TIPIAC. So we're so pleased to have you with us today as well.
Thank you.
And obviously we have Bronwyn Cochrane, Bonney, who is a proud Gamilaraay woman also from New South Wales, and she's the founder and CEO of TIPIAC, and I would imagine that everybody who is joining us today is familiar with Bonney and her work as a teacher and educator. So thank you, Bonney, for organising this conversation and allowing us to have a yarn about why this is such an important topic. And we thank everybody who has joined us online and found time today. We understand everyone is time poor, so we're so pleased that you were able to make this a priority and join us today. So we believe cultural competency is a must for school communities to move forward in embracing the rich diversity of many cultural differences that we deal with in school today. Our focus is on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education, so therefore it is important to have this discussion and focus on what we need to do to make it our business to present an environment where all students and families are comfortable and feel valued and supported in their local schools. It is absolutely vital in today's education system to be culturally competent, especially in the teaching arena. And I think as we're going along, it is just becoming more and more important. Bonney, being the leader of this today's, we might pose the first question to you. Can you let us know why it is important to build this cultural competency and make it our business?
I think it's a great question, and also, I guess, building upon our own cultural understanding and our own competency to be able to implement rich, authentic Indigenous perspectives into our day-to-day, I guess, teaching. What we need to look at developing is a deeper awareness and understanding of the history of our Indigenous peoples. We also need to develop that deeper understanding of the rich, diverse knowledge that, like, our Indigenous people are coming to us with, and our kids are coming to us in our classrooms, and the knowledge that they are coming with. But it's because a lot of them don't feel like their voices are being valued enough. And I think that there's a national, I guess, strategy at the moment around, well, how can we as Indigenous people, I guess, put our voices forward and to make sure that our voices are heard and are valued within, policy decision making up at a federal level, and also within a school level, at a local community level. So I think that we need to look at our own, I guess, biases, or that unconscious biases that we have within ourselves, because that biases, I guess, affects the way that we behave as educators, as people in society. And I think that, the attitudes and beliefs that we each have is that unconscious bias, and it's that influences the way that we think, the way that we act, and the way that we build upon our relationships within, community, within the classroom, within a school system. So I think that, the more we look at reflecting on our own personal values and our own understanding and willingness to actually learn about the rich, diverse culture and history of our Indigenous people, I think the better for our children. Because, our children are the next, the next leaders. And because when they're coming to school with that, that invisible backpack with, all of the things that they're bringing to school from home environment, we need to be able to make sure that we're really understanding where our children are coming from. We need to really understand where, what sort of families they're coming from and who are the community. So we need to be building that knowledge to be able to build on the relationships and to be able to embed authentic perspectives in our everyday lessons. Because once we're valuing that culture and the history and we're embedding that, we as teachers are able to, I guess, connect at a deeper level with the students in the classroom and have those deeper conversations around culture. And the more we do that, the more that we build our own confidence in being able to, embed Indigenous perspectives into all key learning areas. So we need to look at ourselves and look at our own, I guess, understanding and keep building that. I mean, just because you do one course that builds, that's based on building your cultural competency, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're culturally capable now. It's an ongoing process. So we all, and thank you to everybody who's joining us today, because, we know that you value Indigenous education, and otherwise you wouldn't be here with us today. So just really, my heart, you're just making it sing by just being here today.
Thanks, Bonnie. Helen, I might pose the next one to you, which is, why do you think, why should Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education be everybody's business?
Okay, thanks, Zana. First of all, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past and present whose land I stand on today, which is the Bundjalung people's country. So it's everybody's responsibility. I think we're on the cusp of something great. I think we're springboarding into a whole new area of education that's inviting us to have a voice. I think we are looking at our our Indigenous peoples in our schools and saying, okay, we need to listen to what you've got to say and we need to include you in all our conversations. And I think that's obvious too from when we look at closing the gap, and it's just been recognised by the government that up until now it hasn't worked because they haven't listened to Indigenous voice. So that's really, really important. I think it's important too in schools that we look at the policies that are there for us to view. And the Aboriginal education policy is really important. I think we need to know about that. We need to discuss it and be aware of it. I think we need to look at the Melbourne Declaration. These things have all gone ahead of us, and closing the gap and quality education. I think they're all things that come together to make this a really exciting time to be in education, where we can now start to improve the outcomes for our kids. Not that they haven't been improved before, but I think we can make greater improvements as we go forward, because we're focusing on what's important, what do we need to know, and what do we need to put into our teaching to make this a vital place for our kids. So what sort of pedagogies are we using? Are we including our families? Are we building the relationships? Are we embracing diversity? Are we really focusing on our beautiful children in our school and making sure that they understand what we need to do to improve our outcomes, so that Indigenous education is everybody's business? And I think we can start with from at the top in our schools and move right down to the gardener, to be inclusive of all people. And we need to look at how we're going to achieve these outcomes. What are we going to do to really build that relational knowledge and that embrace all those people who've got things to offer us in our schools. And I think, that trust, we must stop stereotyping. We must really embrace reconciliation. And with this focus on cultural competency, how fantastic is that as teachers to look at the histories and look at the histories of Aboriginal people and the histories of the Australian people, look at them together and join our hands and hearts so that we're working for the goodness and the better of everybody. And I believe that we're really moving forward, and I think in the future we're going to see positive outcomes for our kids. I think we're going to see improved results. Not that I'm saying that they haven't been improved up until now, but I think we can improve them more. Otherwise, we wouldn't have closing the gap. And particularly with our focus on including Indigenous voice. And that goes right down to when we invite our parents into our schools and we look at our transition points and how we are making our families feel, making our families belong in our school environment. I think that's where we're going, and I think that's the exciting part of it. And having been in a position where I was in the non-dominant culture, that listening, that deep listening is so important, because our kids are coming into a culture and they are the non-dominants in the school. So are we really listening to what they are saying, and how are we embracing that and making sure that we understand where they're coming from and what's our way forward?
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for that.
Okay, that's all right. Can't hear you.
You're muted.
Me?
Oh no, Zana.
She's still muted.
I've asked to there you go.
Thank you. It just said the host muted me.
Oh my gosh.
That's okay. Craig, I guess as we start to talk about that more localized connection, why is it important to build a knowledge of local language within a school context?
Okay. Firstly, Yurada Gubba, Yamagay Nye Craig Duncan, Nye Yagi Mag Win Nye Dawanda Mari Galgan Nanu, Walai Baga, Nalai Buddha, Gagiga. So what I've just said is, good day. Hello, my name is Craig Duncan. I'd like to remember the lands of the Maori people whose country the meeting is taking on place today. I think knowing language is part of that whole connection with the community that you work in, or the school, wherever you work. And in particular, if you have that language available, it's part of, for myself, I see as a connection to that area, to those people, because previously what's happened is that we weren't allowed to speak our language. And so a lot of communities are in various stages when it comes to language. Some are revitalising their language. Some have misplaced or lost their language altogether. But having language connects you to the schools, to the community, to that place. By knowing where you are situated is the first step. If you know where you're living or whose land you're living on, that's a stepping stone already. You are able to have that connections with any of your community or students. And this even includes Aboriginal English. Like, we forget various things that we expect our children to speak proper English, I think we would use the word, but in some cases it's been a mixture of generational language that's come down, that we don't say everything the correct way. And that also goes back to how Aboriginal languages weren't particularly started or particularly follow the rule of English, where you might say, I'm going to the shop. It might come down to shop I go. And so our Aboriginal English in some cases isn't quite the proper English. And so having that in everyday language, knowing that our students speak this type of language and having that opportunity to understand it, it makes your life, I think, a whole lot better. When you have that connection through language, it's just like food for me. It's like you have that connection through language, and so you know what the kids are talking about, you know what the parents are talking about. You are able to listen and even being part of that conversation. And when it comes to in a school context, it sort of should be part and parcel of the whole syllabus, that you are able to talk about the door in language, you are able to talk about the tree, you are able to talk about the sky, and it just adds to it. I love it that I think English shouldn't be the first language when we talk about acknowledgement to country. If you can speak Italian or you can speak any other language other than English, please do that in language, or by acknowledging it, because it's your language, it's part of you and who you are. And having those schools and those people who have that connection through the language, it gives you the opportunity to make that little step further, or that little bit closer to the community in which we want, because eventually it's like teachers and other people within the school aren't the only ones that are teaching the students, it's our family. And so you need to make that connection not only to the students, but also to our parents and our aunties, our uncles, our grandparents, because they're the holders of language. And I'm sorry, I was just trying to see what the question was being offered there. I think I could answer, there is no offence if white teachers use the local language. It depends on where the community that you are, that if you you need to speak with elders and those that hold the knowledge of language, that they can then speak to you and then pass it on from there. So the question is it's about communications and collaborations. If anything, you need to see past that whole thing that you're not the expert or teachers aren't the expert, but making that opportunity to have that connection to community and via language is a great stepping stone. And doing that is just the first step, I guess.
Excellent. Thanks, Craig. And I think that's something that comes across in everything that we talk about. It's all about those connections with community, and that is for Indigenous and non-Indigenous teachers who are wanting to connect and have that local connection. Do you see the necessity, I guess, Bonnie, in building those strong relationships with Indigenous communities, including the elders, families and wider organisations in the local school region? And I guess the one question, and I know I have so many teachers who come to me with this, is how do they go about it? How do they start that journey to connect with their local community so they can bring that into the classroom?
I think it's absolutely vital that we build those strong relationships with our Indigenous communities, because that in itself will, I guess, foster a safe space for community within the school system. And that's what we're wanting to do. We want our children and our families to feel safe when they're coming into a school system. We want to make sure that, you know, that our schools and our educational, I guess, environments are culturally safe systems. And not only culturally safe systems, but we need culturally, you know, competent teachers as well. And it's, you know, those systems and those teachers need to be always reflecting continuously on their own, I guess, actions in a classroom. So how we go about, you know, implementing those Indigenous perspectives, because it's those things that are happening within a classroom setting that then our kids are taking back into community and talking about. So if they've got no connection within a classroom setting, it's harder to build those relationships. So it's absolutely vital that we as educators make sure that we're trying our best to educate ourselves so that we can embed that into our, you know, teaching programs. And not only that, when the kids are going back out into community and you're valuing that perspective or that knowledge and you're, you know, teaching all the kids in the classroom, those kids are going back into community and talking about that. And then in that itself starts to build that relationship, because then the parents are starting to think, oh, well, I am valued. Like, this teacher really values my knowledge, our history, and they're actually, you know, valuing that to the point where it's being embedded into everyday lessons. And in that itself, you can foster those and start to build those relationships just on that. So, for instance, when I was talking about embedding Indigenous perspectives, what you could do is, like, if you teach say a unit of work over a 10-week period, so a term. And so then at the end of the term, what I would do is, you know, do a, you know, invite community in and do a showcase of what you're actually teaching, so that the parents and community and elders and, you know, the community members are coming in and they're seeing you and the school, like what you're doing within the school to embed that. And to that, I guess, builds relationships. And also it's looking at, you know, it's making sure that our schools are a safe place. So for the first thing when I walk into a school, I'm looking for that connection. Like when I walk in, I haven't been to that school before, what can I see that connects me to my country? Or what connects me to my culture? Is there a mural? Is there, you know, deep conversations going on in the staff room? Are you building your own, you know, cultural understanding? So can I, like, what does it feel like when I walk into a school? So it's, you know, making sure that when community walks into a school, they feel welcome, they feel valued. And I think that, you know, when even like another strategy would be, you know, when parents are waiting around of an afternoon to pick up their children, you know, are they waiting their little groups? So what I would do is, you know, just invite them in for a yarn or a cuppa. So if they're 15 minutes early, invite them in for a yarn, have a cup of tea. Because, you know, the more time that you give them to actually, you know, just have a yarn. And it's not always those, like, what sort of narratives are being told within the staff room? Are you always focusing on, you know, the negative of that child? So how can we bring in some positive conversations and some positive narratives within, you know, within the staff room when we're discussing our children? And then, you know, let that overflow into community. When we're telling those sort of narratives about the positives, they're listening. They'll come in, they'll know. So it's like, well, what can we do to do, like, you know, to change that narrative and to build our own, like it comes back to that, you know, making sure that it's culturally safe as a system and, you know, culturally competent teachers.
Excellent. Thanks, Bonnie. Craig, I might pose this one to you. How do you go about introducing, and I've noticed that we've got some questions coming up in the chat around language, so it's obviously an important topic. How do you go about introducing local language into the school environment, and what are some ways that can be done? And obviously some people are wanting to know what the boundaries are around that, I guess, and who's using language and things like that. So it all comes into that whole thing.
Thanks very much. One of the things that I think we think about is that there were 250 plus languages in Australia before European contact, and 70 alone in New South Wales. So for myself, I look at it that last year was the International Year of Indigenous Languages. That could be a starting point, that with previous policies, Aboriginal people weren't allowed to speak language and were very scared to speak language, and we seem to have lost a bit through that policy. But this is a great way to start back at learning the local language, or in some cases, you might not have a local language around your area, so you might need to think about what's your population or your demographic within a school environment. That you may have kids that are from another nation and they are very dominant in that nation. I know that for myself, who in the Newcastle area, we have a school that has a very high population of Gamilaraay people that have descendancy from the Gamilaraay nation. And so they have talked with community and they have been able to say, well, this is what we're going to go with when it comes to a local language. And why wouldn't you have a local language? Why do we have to go to our French and our German or Italian when we could start looking at a local language by asking the community what they want, our parents, what they would like to see? It's a step forward in that whole thing about reconciliation and to look at what was previously done, that we want to engage with you. We want to have that conversation with you. We don't want to walk in front of you. We don't want to walk behind you. We want to walk beside you when it comes to local languages. And having, like Bonnie said, when they come to your school or to your place and they're early, invite them in, get them to have that little conversation beforehand, before all the big heavy stuff starts happening. Have your people, your elders, find out who speaks language, because in some cases we don't need to have that little piece of paper to say that we're an expert or we're very knowledgeable in what we do, but we know that some of our people in our communities hold that knowledge of language, and so they're the people that you need to look at, have that conversation with to start with, and then go from there. That you can talk to those people and go, well, okay, what would you like? Because in some cases, our community don't want to have teachers or other people do language because they want to hold, that's theirs, that's their knowledge, that's their language, that's what sets them apart from other people. I know that Bonnie and I both are from the same nation, but I have other people that I've sort of have said hello to me, and I know that they're from different nations, and we're completely different as Aboriginal people. Palawa people are completely different. We might be Aboriginal, but we aren't from the same nation, and we speak completely different languages. So having that same little conversation, starting at the small steps, and then build on from there. We don't want to have to sort of go and change everything. It doesn't have to happen overnight, but by doing the small steps of just talking with people, start that conversation within your school, within your office, within your company, your organizations, to sort of go, well, we'd like to know whose land we're on, and we want to start finding out whose land and language, and go from there. Change the signage, have your word. That I know for myself within our diocese, I've started just using Yama, which is just hello. And for me, I'm getting like the director and the assistant directors writing back and saying Yama to me. And like these guys, if I wouldn't have done that, then they would just be going hello to me in English or g'day, sort of thing like that. So starting that by just those little words, those little things that we can do to help with revitalising some of our languages from the 250 that were here before, or at least sort of maintain them.
That's excellent. And it actually really ties in to something that we're doing at World Vision. Is our focus, and you touched on it here, is around the fact that cultural educators in community we see as educated as teachers. They don't need to have a piece of paper, but we see them as the teachers who should be in the classroom helping to teach this, because we value that as much as them being a teacher. So that knowledge that they can share should be valued as much as obviously any teacher who can stand in a classroom, to have someone from community who can come in and give that direct link to the community and be giving it to the students firsthand, which we think should be highly valued. Just before we go off that language subject, Craig, we had somebody ask the question about, I guess they're concerned about worrying whether they're going to offend anybody if they're mispronouncing words when teaching language. So we know quite often that, I know many teachers say that they shy away from talking about Indigenous topics and things like that, because they're always worried they're going to offend somebody, they're going to say the wrong thing. So what they do is they say nothing, which we don't want to discourage. So what are your thoughts around that?
If your intentions are to offend, guess what? You are going to be in trouble. And I say this to our teachers within our diocese, is that you've done the hard yards, you know what you're doing, but in some cases, like you're saying, they don't want to do this because they don't want to offend. But if their intention is to offend, then yes, you will be in trouble, because it's just not that case that you can actually, and that's where our conversations start again. If you do something wrong, don't make a big kerfuffle over it. That's where you should be able, if we're in a meeting and you just say something really, said something really stupid, I'll say stupid, and then don't make a big kerfuffle over it in front of everyone. Pull them aside and have that conversation, so that that person that's made that mistake, that you can say, oh, this is what you should have done, this is what you need to do. Even just the difference between welcoming and acknowledging country. Some of our teachers and parents don't even know the difference. And that's where a starting point of having that conversation. And no, I'm not an expert when it comes to language, but I want to try and keep my language and my skills by doing language and by doing courses that I have that I can say that I'm Gamilaraay and that we are part of a big nation and that we are different to that of Wiradjuri or Bundjalung or Gulbenkian or something like that, to our Western Australian, to our Victorians, to our Northern Territories, that it sets us apart from everyone. And so I think that having that, not intending to offend, you should be fine. Just speak. It's about open communication. Yeah,
absolutely. Thanks for that, Craig. Helen, can you give us your thoughts around how teachers can go about building a cultural safe environment in their schools?
Yes, thanks. Cultural safety is really important. It should be at the forefront of our minds. And how do we do this? It's by the way we start with our kindergarten children, by the way we embrace our families and invite them into our schools. Do we sit down with these families and we have the conversation about their family, get to know who the kids are, build that strong relationship? Then as we go up the school, we continue to build those strong relationships. I think one of the really important things about cultural safety in a school is that we have an immersion program, that wherever we are, we should have an immersion to that specific environment. And each year when new teachers come in, if we have this program set in place and we talk to our teachers, then it gives them a springboard once again into how they're going to work with these kids in their school. Another thing is in those transitions, I think we often forget. We encourage people, we talk to people, we build a relationship in kindergarten. As we go up, it gets less and less and less because we just don't have those connections. But those important connections between primary school to high school are really, really important, that we still get to know the families and we embrace them and bring them in. So all of those things, we need to empower our families. We need to be culturally safe in what we present in our school. When they come in, do they feel confident in talking to someone? Have they got a specific connection with somebody in the school? Can they work with their classroom teacher? Do they need an advocate? How do we build and continue to increase their engagement in our school? And I believe all kids come to school wanting to learn, they want to be there, and then we must put a proactive lens over everything we do and look at the goodness and the richness that our kids bring. We need to connect with our families on positive terms, and we need to make sure that they feel confident in us as leaders and in each other in the school. And I think our teachers in the school need to talk to each other, communicate, discuss, and be holistic in their approach.
Yeah. And see that reflection of themselves, as you mentioned before, around the school.
I think, can I add another little thing too? I think it's really important, the pedagogies we have in our classrooms. And I think one way we've been looking at it through TIPIAC is the 8 ways pedagogy, and seeing that kids don't need to be stuck in a classroom. We've got the environment outside, we can use that, we can do all our literacy work, we can do our maths work, we can be out in the environment, we can be engaging with our elders and our community members. We can look at the health aspect of our kids and the safety aspect of our kids. And when we start to learn those pedagogies and realise that kids in class, sitting up in classroom listening and being spoken at all the time doesn't always work. And Aboriginal people usually like to be spoken with, not spoken at. I think that's really, really important.
Thanks for that, Helen. Bonnie, I might put this one to you that's come in off the chat. Is there a policy in place to support Aboriginal culture and language being taught by Aboriginal people? Obviously, all policies differ from state to state, so I'm not sure where this question has come in from, but maybe if we can talk about it in an overview way.
I think that, you know, every state and territory has like an Aboriginal education policy. But the thing that I see over and over and over again is that there's been no changes.
Yeah.
Like, so, you know, over the past 20 years, we've had the same Aboriginal education policy. It's been embedded into the school, I guess, future plan. What do they call that? You know what I, yeah. So like, you know, they've embedded it into, you know, the key priorities of the school plan.
Yeah.
But yet there's nothing that's been changed. So what I believe is that, you know, we've got these policies there, but there's no, like nobody's, like Michelle's saying there's no accountability. You know, we say that, yes, this all needs to be implemented into our, you know, our teaching programs and our scope and sequences, but where is it really?
Yeah.
What are we doing? Like, we need to, this is why I think that, you know, that self-reflection and building our own cultural competency will allow us to be able to have these conversations with those, like within those leadership teams at our schools. And if we can go to those leaders and say, well, yes, you know, we've got this Aboriginal education policy and it's in our, you know, it's in that future planning, but why haven't we achieved, like, why aren't our kids achieving? It comes back to that, but it comes back to us as teachers, because we know it's there. We're writing our curriculum. We just need to build our own cultural understanding so that we're able to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that we as teachers need to take that responsibility and actually, you know, implement it ourselves and change our own ways of doing and our own, you know, reflect on our own practices always is going to, you know, then reflect on other teachers that are implementing Indigenous perspectives, and then, you know, it's just a roll-on effect. But there's been no accountability whatsoever, but now it is on the cups of change. Like, everybody's talking about, you know, like Zana was saying with having a cultural teacher that's, you know, from community. Like, that's such a great initiative, and that will bring about change. And what we're doing at TIPIAC, you know, developing the content for teachers to actually implement and having these conversations. But it's, you know, we just want some, you know, those leaders to take accountability and, you know, put it in and make sure that their teachers are actually doing what they're meant to be doing.
And that's what somebody has asked that question about, the accountability. And I guess that's something that we look at. We run these webinars and we have so many teachers who sign up. So I guess the one question that so many of them ask is, they are on board, they're trying to create change in their schools. Do you have a recommendation for them on how they get the principals to come on that journey with them? Because obviously it has to come from the top to filter into the school. One teacher can't, unfortunately, make all this change on their own. They need support from leadership. What are your thoughts around making the principals more accountable, and how can they get them to prioritise this? Because so many other areas of schools are prioritised and given time. How can we make them see the importance of cultural competency in their schools?
Great question. Just like, for instance, like the thing that I've been reading over and over lately, if you haven't read it, go and get it, like download it and read it, is this document.
Carly.
Like, really read it over and over. So it's like, you know, the ATSL document on Indigenous cultural competency in the Australian, and it's just like full of rich ways that we could do it. But it's like, when we go to our principals and we're talking to them, we need to, you know, make sure that we've got those sort of documents and we know the policies, we know the research, we've done our research, then take that to them and say, well, how can we do this as a whole school? Or how can we, you know, embed this, or, you know, send a few to culturally competent, like, courses. So we provide like a cultural competency building course that's based around, you know, at the end of that course, you'll walk away with some ways of embedding Indigenous perspectives into your literacy and your numeracy, as well as starting that process of building your own cultural competency. So it's like building that understanding around Indigenous culture, because once you've done that, then you can go to your principal and say, well, you know, what are we doing about this?
Don't give up.
And ask that question, what are we doing?
Yeah.
And then just see what their response is, and then, you know, give them that document. I'll get Lena Jade to put it into the
it's already there, Bobby.
Oh, perfect. Perfect.
Thanks, Tanya.
I think one of the really important things too is don't give up, especially when you're trying to do it yourself in a school. That's really, really difficult. But if you can encourage other teachers to come on board and show them some of the things you're doing, and you're including Indigenous perspectives, and you're using your environment, and you're communicating with your community, and you're inviting Aboriginal people into your classroom, I think that's when you start to get some traction. But my big thing is do not give up, because it will make a difference.
Absolutely. And be the role model within the school. And then people will start, like, when you're developing those relationships with the community and with your kids, like, other teachers and like those leadership teams are watching you. So when they see you doing really well, they're like, oh, let's get her on our leadership team, or him, or, do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Can I just say something? As a person going through my education, I never had an Aboriginal teacher. I never had that person other than a white Anglo-Saxon teacher standing in front of me. And I always thought that as a teacher, I was doing this great thing about teaching in front of our Murray kids, our Aboriginal kids, and that they would be, it's like a role model. It's like, yeah, I'm a role model, blah, blah, blah. But then someone sort of went, well, these kids, our students, they are having an Aboriginal person, not just our Murray kids, but our white kids, all students in our classroom, they have had the experience of having an Aboriginal person teach them, which I never had. And to be able to show them and bring knowledge, not from a piece of paper, but from where they've come from. I had the opportunity to be out on country and teach on country for 15 plus years. And that's where I get my knowledge from, that having that opportunity to pass on to our work colleagues, to be able to sit down and have that conversation about Aboriginal education, and that it's not only up to me as a teacher, it's up to everyone. It's like you're part of this child's life, education and growth as well, that we need to do this together. It's not for Aboriginal people to do this themselves.
Absolutely.
Agree.
Absolutely. And that is what we're talking about, that it's not just, we're not just talking about bringing this cultural safety and capability into schools for Indigenous children. It is for non-Indigenous kids as well, because we need them to respect and want to learn about our culture as much as we do. So that is so important, to have you standing up at the front of that classroom. And that's what we talk about, having cultural educators and teachers in the classroom learning directly and teaching the students. Craig, we've got some more coming in around language, and you seem to be a bit of an expert in that area, so we might go back to you. Would it be offensive, we've got a teacher wanting to know about wanting to learn words and have them written phonetically? Obviously, this goes back to that worrying about pronunciations and things like that. So what are your thoughts around that?
What you could do first up is that if you are struggling, because remember that English is quite different to a lot of Aboriginal languages or Australian languages, that our tongues will be in a certain position that you would never have to use within English. And so having that if you need to write it phonetically just first up, yeah, that's fine. But then also make sure that you are learning the correct spelling, or a right way of knowing how to spell that word. It's like Yama, it's Y-A-A-M-A, and people will go, well, what's the double A? Well, it's an R sound, so it's like Yama, and it's write phonetically, but then also make sure that you have the correct spelling, or at least the right way of spelling it, sort of, and go from there. Because I do the same at times, because I'm still learning my language, and I'm in a space where I have at least another 6 other language groups that I need to look at. And it's like, I want to be able to say hello to them in language. I want to be able to say goodbye, but I want to be able to pronounce it correctly myself. And you go to those people that know this knowledge, that you go to someone that might know how to say hello or how to use words. Our community members, it's, again, getting community involved in learning language or having language around the school. I just want everyone to sort of start knowing where they come from or whose land, because again, Australia is just, it's not only Aboriginal Australia, it's white Australia as well. And we acknowledging where you come from and whose country you're on, that's a starting point.
Absolutely. So for schools, we've got one teacher saying they're obviously in an area where there's numerous communities and there's a willingness to adopt teaching of the local language, but choosing which one is challenging. This also happens for schools who are perhaps on contested land as well. What would your thoughts be around that?
I would work out what languages are being spoken, because it may be that one language doesn't have the resources that you need to teach that language. They may only have small parcels of it, whereas the other language that you could be on, I'll use a language group, Wanarua and Awabakal. And so having those two, which are close and some are contested in our area, that you go, well, okay, who do we have here that we can teach language? Who do we have there that can teach Awabakal? Who can teach Wanarua? And so it's those sort of things that if you have the speakers or the knowledge and holders of language that can teach that language, that's a starting point. But we also think about that Aboriginal people just didn't speak their language. They spoke anywhere from 2 up to 3, 4 or 5 different languages, because they were closely in areas where they sort of a river separated Warramai country from a Wabakal country or something like that. And it's just those sort of things. Work out where you start, your starting point. Have that conversation starting with what language group am I in? And then go from there. Go to your local lands council that might be able to help. Go to your universities that are teaching language. Go to your TAFE. Go to all these places that have that, those courses that might be running, and go, well, okay, let's think about that. Go to your native tribunal of native title, because in some cases they might have the knowledge of saying, well, okay, that's what that language or that land you're on. You're on Warramai land, or you're on Wabakal land.
Yeah.
And also the AECG is a great one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Bonnie, somebody's asking if you've got any recommendations for further study. I know that a long time ago, Indigenous education was a very small part of your university education. So they're wondering if they want to further their study now, your recommendations around that.
I think it's just like on topics, for instance, like if you want to learn about cultural competency, then you just, like when you're going into Google, like you could, there's the academic Google site where you can like download research papers around a certain topic that you're interested in. I think that'd be a great start, because then that will also lead into, you know, because they mention other papers. It's also getting books, like this Sand Talk is a great book by Tyson Yunkaporta. Like there's lots of different, you know, Indigenous authored books that you can get. And even within a classroom, like what Indigenous books do you have, like for your literacy lessons, for your maths lessons? But the way that I would do it is like I just type into like whatever I'm trying to research around a topic, I just put it into and just download research papers, and also get on YouTube. I learned so much on YouTube because I just type in a topic that I want to learn about, and then you just go down this rabbit hole of, and you could be there sitting for, you know, 2-3 hours just learning from different community members, because on YouTube they've also got community members talking about different aspects of culture, and just the you know, the Google academic site.
Someone just said, have you heard anything about the Master of Indigenous Education at Macquarie Uni? Are you familiar with that?
No,
No,
at Macquarie Uni.
No, that's okay. Just for everybody who is still popping questions into the chat, continue to do so, because we won't get obviously through them all today, because we'll be wrapping up very shortly. But Bonnie will get a copy of the questions, and I know that through her Facebook page and her website, she'll obviously be able to answer those for you. So continue to pop them in there. That's great. Just wondering, probably one last question, Bonnie, you might be able to help. Any advice about teaching Indigenous art in a respectful way? I've actually seen this question coming up a lot lately. Are non-Indigenous teachers allowed to teach it? And in what way could it be done? Again, we're probably going back to that, inviting someone into the classroom to assist, aren't we? Yeah.
That's the first thing I would do as, you know, when you're implementing an Indigenous art unit or something. What I'd do is I'd look at who's in your community that is an artist, first and foremost. What sort of, are there any significant sites in your area that have art? So you're like taking it back to a local context. You get Indigenous artists in, and, you know, you could like do a unit of work around a local artist's pieces. Get them in, talk about the art styles, and then like at a deeper level, what you could do if you've got, you know, say somebody in your area, like maybe dot paintings. So they've done a lot of dot paintings. You can get the artist in to show those. And then another way to, like, you know, I guess, go wider into exploring the different types of art styles is that then compare to other artists around Australia, but make sure that they are Aboriginal artists and that you're giving them credit.
Yes. Yeah.
That is the biggest thing. You can't just, Google Aboriginal art.
Cultural appropriation.
Yes.
Issue, isn't it?
Exactly,
yeah.
Absolutely. Because you're not giving that credit to the artist. And like,
that's,
so at the moment, there's so many art that's been stolen and actually put on clothing.
Yes.
Or even as going as far as, when you're buying a shirt, make sure that you're buying from an Indigenous business.
Very important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's a big thing for everybody, even if you are just purchasing items, if you're purchasing education books, art, like Bonnie said, T-shirts, please ensure that it is authentic. Please ensure that the money is going back to the community and to the artist. I always check the websites and everything where I purchase anything to make sure that it's not being culturally appropriated. That's a really big issue that a lot of Indigenous artists do find that they're struggling with. We've had some more great questions coming through, but we will be about to wrap up in a moment. Bonnie, is there anything that you would like to finish off with? And we thank obviously all our speakers for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you very much to all that have participated. It's people like Bonnie had said earlier, it's people like yourself who want to make a change when it comes to Aboriginal education, and in particular by doing and participating here, that's that step forward that we are doing as a whole.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us, Craig and Helen and Zana and everybody.
No.
It's been wonderful.